Okay, so this week we are moving on to ecosystems. Before we had discussed population ecology, which is just all of the organisms that exist in a particular area, all of the organisms of the same species that exist in a particular area as a population. Then we talked about community ecology and the way that different organisms interact with one another. So things like predation, parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, that's all community things. Those are all community interactions. Now we're going to be talking about ecosystems. So when you're thinking about an ecosystem, you can think about it as the community, which we just looked at, plus all of the abiotic, components in the way in which the biotic components interact with those and one another. So we're adding an extra level. We're zooming out a bit and we're adding more complexity. And what the book has here is this picture of the Karner blue butterfly. I added a picture of a female to this figure because these butterflies are hugely sexually dimorphic, meaning that the males and females are different, and I thought they were pretty. So this is showing a Karner blue butterfly and the live lupin, which the Karner blue butterfly uses as its food plant. The reason that this is shown and the reason that we're even talking about this is because these blue lupins that these butterflies need to survive live in areas called oak savanna. And in oak savannas, it's usually just a few oaks with really barren soil. And these actually live also in areas called pine barrens, which are, a few pine trees, a few medium-sized pine trees, but also, relatively infertile soil. And the reason the soil is infertile in these areas is because they're largely dependent upon fire. So a lot of the plants that live here will only bloom or will only reproduce if there is fire in the area. And so because of the depletion of the soils as a result of those fires, these areas are usually quite, they're nutrient poor, is I guess how I would say it. And what does this have to do with ecosystems? So an ecosystem ecologist might study the importance of limited resources in the maintenance of an ecosystem. Okay, so basically, when you're studying ecosystems, very often you are looking at the resources, the way that the energy, the way that nutrients is passing through a particular environment, passing through a particular ecosystem. So we talked about population, so you might have a population of Karner blues. We talked about communities, which might be the way in which these Karner blues interact with these lupins. The way their caterpillars are eating the leaves of this lupin in order to survive. And now we're talking about ecosystems, which typically has to do with the way that energy is being transferred between biotic, abiotic components, and not just energy, but nutrients as well. Just to be sure that I've completely nailed this down, the way the textbook phrases it is researchers interested in ecosystems ecology study the importance of limited resources in this ecosystem and the movement of resources such as nutrients through the biotic and abiotic portions of the ecosystem. Okay? And that's why our friend, the beautiful Karner blue, is the first figure in this chapter. So there are three basic types of ecosystem: freshwater, which is streams, lakes, rivers, ponds; marine ecosystems, which are oceanic, saltwater; and terrestrial, which is land. Within these three sort of categories, there are individual ecosystem types that are based on the environmental habitat and the other organisms that are present, and we're going to talk about those. And usually within ecosystems, there are all those community interactions that we had been discussing last week in order for those different populations to try to get the most resources possible. So, things like space, light, minerals, nutrients, food, things that are allowing these organisms to drive their metabolic processes, their ability to drive their metabolism. And we're going to talk about metabolism later on, but what I mean by metabolism is the chemical processes that are happening within an organism that allow it to live, that allow it to survive. This is going to be things like respiration and photosynthesis. We're going to get to that shortly, but the point I'm making here is within ecosystems, there is still that struggle for resources that exists because resources are limiting factors that things need to survive, and so there's competition. So I mentioned the three different types of basic ecosystems you can have. Freshwater is the least common ecosystem on Earth. It makes up a little bit less than 2% of the Earth's surface, and again, that's lakes, rivers, springs. Freshwater ecosystems are incredibly diverse. As you saw in a previous lecture, I just looked at one droplet of water, and there was a multitude of organisms living there. The most common ecosystem on Earth is the marine ecosystem, and that is 75% of the Earth's surface. Marine ecosystems consist of shallow ocean, and deep ocean bottom. The shallows are incredibly diverse and have things like coral reef. The deep ocean has a ton of plankton and krill that support it, and both shallow and deep oceans are important to Earth because that's where about 40% of life's photosynthesis happens. The oceans are absolutely necessary for life. We also have in the terrestrial sphere, we have these things called terrestrial biomes, which are large-scale communities of organisms that are usually defined by the dominant plant type that lives there. So things like oak forests or chaparral or rainforest, things like that. And actually, the main biomes that you're going to hear about, the ones that we're going to talk about, are tropical rainforests. We'll also talk about tropical dry forests a little bit, savannas, deserts, grassland, temperate forest, tundra. Those are sort of the main ones that we have on Earth. And we actually have lots of diversity within those biomes as well. So these are both desert biomes. This one here is the Boa Vista in Cape Verde in Africa, and there's like nothing living here. It says devoid of plant life. I'm sure there are some plants, but nothing much is growing in this desert ecosystem, whereas you have the Saguaro National Park in Arizona. Yeah, in Arizona. And there's tons of things living out there. If you go to Joshua Tree here in California, it is a desert biome, but there is just a multitude of life living in that area. So just because something exists in a particular biome doesn't mean that it necessarily has the same exact characteristics. Before we get to that, I also wanted to talk about ecosystem disturbances. And these are things that can basically lead to an impact on the composition in a particular environment. So this could be things like yearly variation in rainfall and temperature. As you guys should know, we have been experiencing a drought here in California up until a couple of years ago. That's clearly going to have a huge impact on the environment. Or you could have things like lightning causing a forest fire, I believe is an example that the book uses, which is going to lead to what's called ecological succession. Ecological succession is an ecosystem returning to a prior state. And so when we learned about succession in the reading last week, but one great example of succession would be like Mount St. Helens blowing up. And so you're going from what was a forest back to just rock. Okay? And so the process of animals coming in and returning that area from just rock back into a forest is what you would call the process of succession. Okay? So there's a couple of different terms that we're going to learn here that are associated with this process of disturbance and succession. We have the idea of resistance, which maybe should make some intuitive sense to you. But resistance is the ability of an ecosystem to remain in equilibrium despite having a lot of disturbances. All right. So resistance is how much that ecosystem can resist the disturbance. We also have resilience. And resilience is the speed at which an ecosystem returns to its previous state. How fast does that succession take place, and how fast do you go from, a burnt out forest with just stumps and scrub trees and not very much back to the forest that it was before the fire. So resistance and resilience. Let's keep on going. The next idea, and actually I'm going to save this for the next lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to start talking about food chains and how those food chains and food webs, how those things work and how the energy is transferred through them. That'll hopefully make more sense once we start talking about it in the next lecture.